Hi everyone, welcome back to Learning with Leah. I'm glad you could join me again today. Today we're going to dive in and talk about the past perfect tense. So the last video on this grammar series I did was the present perfect tense, so make sure to check that out if you have not seen that one already. But today we're going to be just talking about the past perfect tense. What is it? When do we use it? And how do we use it? All right, so let's get started and I'll answer those questions. The first question you might have is, well, what is the past perfect tense and when do I use this? So the answer is much easier than the present perfect tense. Past perfect tense is much more clear and very direct rather than present perfect tense where there's many different ways that we can use that tense. So the first thing you need to know is that the past perfect tense is talking about actions that were completed in the past, but before another action that was in the past. Okay? So it was an action that was completed in the past. So past perfect is all about the past. Okay? We are talking about two actions when we talk about the past perfect. We are talking about two actions and how one action happened before the other action. So I'll explain a little bit more in detail. So when do we use this tense? Like I said, this is much easier to understand than the present perfect. The present perfect had like 7 different ways we could use those and use that tense. With past perfect, there's only 2 really clear answers of when we use this. The first is a completed action that happened before another action. So let's first look at this timeline. This is the timeline for number 1. I'll put the number here. Okay? So when we are talking about this, we are talking about how one action happened before another action in the past, right? This is the past. This is now, this is the past. So how one action happened before or by the time this action happened. For example, let's read the examples. She had never traveled before she went to Europe. So going to Europe was the first time she had ever traveled. She had never traveled. So action 1 is that she never traveled before she went to Europe. So any time before here, she had never traveled. Even though this is a negative, it's still considered an action. So she had never traveled, that's action 1, before she went to Europe. Action number 2. Another example. We had cleaned and organized the classes before students started. Okay? We had cleaned and organized the classes before students started. So the action number 1 is cleaned and organized. It's actually 2 actions there, but that's under action 1. Okay? We had cleaned and organized the classes when? Before classes started. Classes started is the second action. So as you can see, number 1, we use past perfect to talk about something that happened before a second action happened. All right, we also have number 2, duration before another action. Duration just means continued, okay, for a continued period of time. So let's look at this one. I'll put this number 2 here. Okay, so for our timeline for number 2. So now, this is now, so this means this is all in the past. So action 1 was a duration and in a continued period of time. So instead of it being just one action, like this was just one action. This action is drawn out, right? It happened over a period of time, but it stopped when action 2 happened, okay? By the time action 2 happened, it stopped. So that is the difference. There's 2 ways we can use this, but it's very clear how to use it. So let's look at some examples for number 2. So the duration before another action. For example, I had walked 2 miles by lunchtime. So 2 miles, walking 2 miles, right? It's not one moment. You don't walk 2 miles over one moment, right? It is a duration. It takes time to walk 2 miles. So this is action 1. I walked 2 miles when? by lunchtime. So lunchtime is action 2. The second example, we had the blue car for 5 years before it broke down. Okay? We had the blue car for 5 years before it broke down. So this is a good example of a continued action. Okay? We had a blue car for 5 years, right? Me and my husband had a blue car for 5 years. That was a continued action for 5 years. But it broke down eventually. So when it broke down, of course, we don't have it anymore. We had it until this second action. All right? So we can either have 2 actions in the past that are separate, okay? Or we have an action that continues for a duration until a second action happens. All right? Hopefully that is clear for you. Now, what is important to remember is that we can use specified time. If you did watch my present perfect tense video, I explained that for present perfect, we cannot specify time. We talk about things very generally in the present perfect. But with the past perfect, we can specify time. We can specify time and say when an event happened, okay? We could say we cleaned and organized the classrooms on Tuesday before students started class on Wednesday. We can specify time in the past perfect, but not in the present perfect. So now let's look at how to conjugate and how to change this tense between the affirmative, the negative, and questions. For the past perfect tense, we first are going to start with our rule. Of course, it always starts with our subject. Then we're going to add had. Okay? In the present perfect tense, we use the present tense of has and have, but not for the past perfect. For the past perfect, we use had, and then we also use the past participle. So the only difference between using present perfect and past perfect is that the has and have in the present perfect changes to had for past perfect. So it's very important that you have the correct form when you are using present perfect and past perfect, because otherwise it can be confused easily for the person reading what you are writing. So make sure we have had there. As I said before, the past participle just means it's the ed ending for a regular verb. Okay, for example, learn, the main verb learn, the past participle would be learned. Now, we will have to remember that irregular verbs do not use ed, they have other endings, so it's important that you know if it's a regular or irregular verb. So let's look at the examples here. I had learned, you had learned, he, she, it had learned, we had learned, you had learned, they had learned. Okay, so all of these are the same, which is really nice. Okay, as you remember in the present perfect video, the third person singular was different and we use has. But for past perfect, it's easy, it's all the same. So there's no need to change anything depending on the persons. All of the persons, whether singular or plural, are the same. The reason why I put some dots here though, it's important to remember, they had learned is not a sentence. We can't, even though it has a subject and a verb, we cannot end here because past perfect has to have 2 actions or either an action and a time frame. So because that does not have the 2 actions, this is not a complete sentence. So that is why I put the dots to mean it will continue. Okay, let's look at some examples. I had gotten home before the storm. You had sang 3 songs before the show ended. She had ran 5 miles by the end of practice. We had already eaten dinner when he got home. They had brushed their teeth before going to bed. Okay, so as you notice, we always have our subject, then we have had, then we use our past participle. So as you can see, we do have some irregular verbs here. Eaten, ran, and sang and gotten are all irregular verbs. Of course, it does not stop there though. For past perfect, we have to somehow explain that there was another action happening in the sentence. Okay, if we just want to say they brushed their teeth, we don't need the past perfect tense. If you only want to say the first action, and it's just one action, then you use the simple past. The reason why we use the past perfect is to show the time between two events. Okay, so that's why we have to have the two events to use past perfect. For negative sentences, you might already know what to do now. The only thing we have to do is just add our negative. Our negative is not. Okay, we always add the negative between our helping verb and our main verb. So our helping verb here is had, and our main verb is the past participle. So we are going to use not in between there. It has to be in between. It cannot be before had, and it cannot be after the past participle. So let's look here. I had not gone. You had not gone. He, she, it had not gone. We had not gone. You had not gone. They had not gone. So, some examples. I hadn't gone home yet. You hadn't played soccer before then. He hadn't studied English before now. We hadn't been to the library until our teacher took us. They hadn't slept all night. All right, as you can see, we always use our subject, then we use had, then we use our negative, and then our past participle. Most of these are regular. There's a couple that are irregular. Slept, gone, and been. So some things to point out. Contractions. So as you can see, I used a contraction here to bring together had and not. So we can say hadn't. Hadn't. Again, hadn't. Now, I didn't mention on the affirmative, but we can also use contractions with our different subjects and had. So actually, using our different subjects and had is the same as using a contraction for would. So I'd means I had or I would. How you tell the difference is the context of the sentence. So you can tell if it is would or had by the sentence, by the context of what you are trying to say. So all of these can be used for had or would. Let's read them together. I'd, you'd, he'd, she'd, we'd, they'd. All right? I'd, you'd, he'd, she'd, we'd, they'd. All right? Okay. The only one that you might have noticed that is not here is it. We cannot contract it with had or with would because it ends in a T, right? A hard sound. We cannot add a D to it to make it smoothly, right? It does not come off the tongue well. So we do not contract it. We would just say it had or it would. Okay. All right, let's look at questions next. For questions, the only thing we have to do is switch the place of the subject and the first verb or the helping verb. As you can see, we start with had instead of the subject. Then we have the subject. Then we have the past participle, So as you can see, had I eaten, had you eaten, had he, she, or it eaten, had we eaten, had you eaten, had they eaten. Okay? The nice part is, again, the only thing that changes is going to be what subject you're using. But that's it. We don't have to change or conjugate for the different persons, which is really, really nice. So We add our had, we use the subject, and then we use the past participle. Let's look at these examples. Had I come by then? Had you played before then? Had it rained? Have we met before then? Had they left the party? Okay, so one thing I want to explain is that I had mentioned before that two actions you have to be talking about two actions, right? You cannot just use talking about one action. Just with one action, you will use the simple past. What's important to know though is even though you need to have two actions, in conversation, sometimes the other person already knows you are talking about two actions. So each sentence doesn't have to have both actions all of the time. So if you are introducing what you are talking about, then yeah, you need to explain what actions you are referring to. But if you are already in conversation, and in your conversation you have already addressed and talked about the two actions, you don't always have to repeat it, right? It will sound very choppy in your conversation if you repeat both actions in every sentence you are saying. So in conversation, for example, had it rained, right? If you wanted just to know, did it rain? You would just use simple past. But if you were talking about another action, maybe you are talking about a past event and you said, oh my goodness, I was very nervous on my wedding day because the tent and everything, the wedding was outside and I was very nervous for that. And someone might ask, well, had it rained? Had it rained before? Did you have to clean up the rain before the wedding? So as you can see in the conversation, you did not have to say, had it rained before the wedding started, right? You don't have to say the second event all the time, as long as it is addressed in the conversation. So I think it is time for practice. So let's get started with that. It's practice time. All right, so hopefully you know by now, these questions are for you. Make sure you answer them and comment below. Then I will answer you and I will comment back to you if there are any mistakes or anything you need to change in your sentences. Okay, so I have 7 questions for you. I have included a subject and a main verb for you. What is in the parentheses is just extra information. So you can just copy that to the end of the sentence. And then here, 8 and 9, I want you to make your own. Be creative. So this is an example together so you understand what you're going to do. So I have the subject, I have not, and then I have the verb eat. So we are going to first say Jessica. So Jessica, we can just repeat her name or we can say she. Jessica. And then we have not. So that means we are going to have a negative in there. But first, we remember we have to have had before the negative. So had and then not, I'm going to make a contraction. Jessica hadn't. Then we need the past participle of eat. I know eat is not a regular verb, so that means I need eaten. Jessica hadn't eaten. Okay, and then the rest of the sentence, until she got home. Okay, until she got home. Jessica hadn't eaten until she got home. All right, that is the answer for that. So I want you, if you want to pause the video or screenshot the video and then comment below, I would be more than happy to answer any questions you have or respond if you have any mistakes. I love hearing from you, so that is my favorite part. All right, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope to see you next time and have a great evening, everyone.